Hi everybody, my name's Sebastian, and I'm 17 years old. I have a rather odd question for you. Tell me, how'd you get along with your best friend's mums? And what about the mothers of your friends who are not very close, or even just acquaintances? Do they invite you to dinners they make? Do you talk to them about yourself and your life? And the last question, has anyone ever secretly kept in touch with your friend's mum? Because that's exactly what my story is about, and how I began to think that my friend's mum was in love with me. Not very long ago, a guy named John transferred to my school. I saw him a couple of times in the school hallways, but we didn't know each other very well until John got onto our school baseball team. I've been a part of the team for 2 years now. I'm seriously thinking about a career in sports, and I can even call myself a fan of professional baseball. John loves the game too, as I soon found out. After one of our training sessions, John invited me to come over to his house and see all of his sports memorabilia. John had a baseball signed by Roger Clemens himself. Of course, it sounded very interesting, so I agreed. When I arrived at John's house, his mother, Mrs. Glover, was there. She was young looking, a little bit curvy, and she was a housewife who was around 45 years old. She was busy with something in the kitchen, so we decided to just say hello and quickly sneak off to John's room. But our meeting lasted for a little longer than the nanosecond needed to say hello. When we peered into the kitchen and Mrs. Glover turned her head, hearing our voices, her face suddenly changed, and the large cup of coffee that she was holding in her hands suddenly dropped to the floor. She didn't even seem to notice what happened. For a few seconds, she just looked straight at my face. I felt slightly uncomfortable, but I didn't have time to do anything about it. Mrs. Glover apologized and began to wipe the floor while John and I went to his room. But no more than 15 minutes later, she appeared again. She knocked on John's bedroom door, but did not wait for an answer, and entered the room with a large tray of sandwiches and tomato juice, like she decided that we were hungry or something. It was pretty strange. I was visiting John for the first time. We weren't best friends, and I just stopped by for a moment to see a baseball. So why was she paying so much attention to us? To make matters even more awkward, she sat down next to me, clearly not planning to leave. She got in the middle of my conversation with John and asked me to tell her about myself, asking so many questions about my life. It felt awkward, but of course I answered politely. What else could I do? At some point during the conversation, she put her hand on top of mine, and I almost flinched. John didn't try to save me and just stayed silent, although I could not help but notice that he was irritated and angry. So I myself had no choice but to make up some excuse to leave their house as soon as possible. I was not used to this attention from even my best friend's mothers, so Mrs. Glover made me really nervous. The next day at school, I approached John and asked him point blank what was wrong with his mother, and why did she always behave so strangely. But John himself was very surprised by her paying extra attention to me, since in general, she was never intrusive. She was on good terms with all of John's old friends, but never stuck her nose in their lives. This really confused me. So when, a few days later, John told me that his mother had invited me to dinner, I refused immediately, saying that I apologized, but I couldn't make it because I was very busy. Of course, I wasn't busy at all. I just didn't want to see Miss Glover, but she found another way to get to me. Some more time passed, and I suddenly noticed some suspicious activity on my Instagram and Twitter, all from one particular follower. At first, I didn't realize who it was, because the picture in the profile was small, and the nickname was unfamiliar. But when I looked closer, guess what? It was Mrs. Glover. She liked almost all of my pictures and tweets, going back to some very, very old ones. This meant that John's mum had spent a lot of time browsing through my stuff. Realizing this sent shivers down my spine, but when I received a private message from her, I still could not just ignore it, and I wrote her back, so we began to write to each other. Nothing special. There was nothing strange about the content of these messages, and I don't even remember what they were about. We just chatted, in the same way I would with any other girl, but not necessarily my friend's mum. When I realized this, it suddenly struck me. What if Miss Glover was falling in love with me? Because this was the only explanation for her strange behavior that I could come up with. I decided to talk to John about it. I went to his house and told him everything while we were hanging out in his room, making sure that Mrs. Glover didn't hear us. But John, to put it lightly, overreacted. I was expecting that he would laugh or facepalm, and if he believed that his mother was in love with me, he would be surprised and embarrassed. But instead, he ran out of his room and up to his mother. I didn't follow him until I heard him shouting at her, and then leaving the house. Mrs. Glover looked upset. I approached her and tried to somehow apologize to her for the scene that John had just made. I felt guilty about it, and she suddenly burst into tears and said, "What a good boy you are, Sebastian," while hugging me tightly. And after that, she explained everything to me. John's reaction was understandable. She had once been unfaithful to her husband, John's father, and their family had to go through very hard times. So John was simply scared that this would happen again, but she was definitely not in love with me. I just looked so much like her older son, who died after a long illness when he was only 15. She showed me a photo. The resemblance was really uncanny. Seeing me brought back painful memories for her. That's why she could not help but cling to me, as if I was something that bound her to her dead son. And after a while, she was just talking to me. That's all. John didn't know that I looked like her son because he had never met him. In fact, she's John's stepmother. She met John's dad after the death of her son and raised John as her own child from the age of 10. Now, everything fell into place. However, my friendship with John somehow ended after this, but I still keep in touch with Mrs. Glover. It seems that she's become a real friend for me. Tell me, have you ever got into a strange or ridiculous situation with your friends' mothers? Do you have any interesting stories related to this? Write about it in the comments and subscribe to the channel.